everybody. Reporting to you again from the Glamour City, Hollywood.
Looking at it from the scorecard standpoint, when you think about the first component, which is waste prevention, the methodology by which P2 Science is producing this chemical, actually, in comparison to traditional solutions, they actually eliminate 95% of the waste by designing out the waste. So therefore they achieve an economy of waste. They achieve an economy of space. These chemical molecules are smaller, more compact, and this process is, it's a continuous process. It's intensified. That's just a chemistry term that was relevant to this use case. But essentially, those three elements speak to waste prevention, which helps them achieve that 95% better than your traditional product.
If you love listening to this show, please consider giving a rating and a review on Amazon Alexa or wherever you listen. We want to continue bringing you this amazing content, and part of our ability to do that means that we need a big audience. Now, it may not seem like much, but rating and reviewing the show will help more people find us, just like how you found this show. Simply on any podcast platform, search for a show, scroll down to the bottom, and push 5 stars. It's that easy. Thanks for supporting the show. Today, I'm joined by Dr. Urvashi Bhatnagar, healthcare executive and co-author of the Sustainability Scorecard. Welcome to the show today.
Thank you. Thanks for having me, Scott.
So you've been in healthcare for a long time. And of course, you even have your doctorates in physical education as well. And I wonder, when we think about healthcare and the correlation to climate change, why do you feel that climate change is a public health epidemic?
It's interesting, Scott. When I started my career, this wasn't such a focus as it is now. But for me, it was always evident that climate change has a huge impact on human health. And I could see that when I started my career in India, on the impact of the social and environmental determinants of health on my patients' well-being, that, their one-time or ongoing check-ins with their physicians and care team really weren't the key determining factors to their overall lifelong well-being. And so when we think about, in the context of today, we have digital health tools, things like that. Many of the conditions or diseases we see today can actually be linked back to climate change or the negative externalities of our economic activities that influence human health. So when you think about groundwater contamination and things like that, or even direct effects like rising global temperatures and the impact of that on our human body and our ability to tolerate different temperatures and self-regulate. So climate change has a wide-ranging effect on the human body. It is sending our kids to the ER. We just have not recognized it in mainstream conversation as the trigger for all of these symptoms that we see today.
Well, I think I like the way you characterize it by stating as negative externalities. And I think it's, in some ways, it's actually even broader than climate change. So if you look at the example of during the kind of the post-industrial revolution, where you had combustion engines, and there was a period of time when you had what they had called knocking problems, where the firing of the cylinders didn't quite work properly. So one of the solution was adding a particular solvent into the gasoline, which basically had lead. And studies have shown over many decades now that lead in gasoline basically, in some ways, actually not only created health problems on a major epidemic level, but also decreased the IQ of many people that were exposed to the lead level as well. So that's an example of human-created negative externalities. Now, you co-wrote the Sustainability Scorecard, How to Implement and Profit from the Unexpected Solutions, along with Dr. Paul Anastas, to show how business leaders and innovators can create breakthrough sustainable products and processes that are good for the planet, human health, and profit. Can you tell us more?
Absolutely. So I will say, yes, our scorecard is actually based on Paul Anastas's extensive research at Yale on green chemistry. And he, along with his co-author, John Warner, previously had come up with the 12 principles of green chemistry that are now widely adopted in the industry by leading organizations worldwide, multilaterals, and in academics. This is extensively peer-reviewed and acknowledged as sort of the pillars of green chemistry and how to create essentially inherently sustainable products and processes. And so what Paul and I have collaborated on doing together is distilling these chemistry principles into 4 management principles, because we know that there is nothing as wasteful as a fabulous product that can really advance humanity if it is not managed well. The graveyard of really effective products is ever growing if they are not introduced and scaled in an effective manner. And so when you think about sustainability, we have 4 recommendations or 4 principles that we recommend that firms follow. Waste prevention, maximizing efficiency and performance, using renewable inputs, and ensuring safe degradation. And essentially what these 4 principles are telling you to do in a nutshell is to evaluate your entire life cycle of the product or process, from the design phase until the point that your product actually either enters a graveyard or is upcycled in any way. But firms need to take accountability for that entire life cycle, because there's profitability along the way. And we get into elucidating that in the book.
So I'm going to give a kind of a tangential analogy. In the Internet of Things, in the early years of formation of that industry, you had a lot of component manufacturers that were creating modules, sensors, and components for the Internet of Things, but they were not incented to necessarily embed security into it. So what you had was eventually kind of full end product that would, get manifested into, let's say, cameras and recorders and whatnot. But yes, they had Internet of Things capability through some sort of signal processing and some, bandwidth protocols, but they didn't have the fundamental, firmware and the software and the over-the-air internet security aspects that were built into it. And it's all because it wasn't built into the incentive structure. So if you go back into the incentive structure, because it's one thing to tell corporations or innovators to do it, but how do we align the incentives so that they want to do it and it makes sense from a pro forma perspective?
Absolutely. I mean, what we get into a little bit in the book is the heart or the kernel of this argument is to say, let's expand the definition of performance. If your product or process is extractive and, and is distilling all these negative externalities on humanity, which is your consumers, for generations and generations to come, but it is highly effective, overall, it is a poorly performing product. Consumers today are very well aware of what is in their products, and they're making very conscious decisions as to how they're purchasing. And so when we think about that, this tells firms to expand the definition of performance and really think about it by going beyond effectiveness and efficacy to include social and environmental wellness, and evaluate that entire spectrum when they look at product performance.
Well, certainly, I think it has to be multi-pronged. It has to be consumer-led, but also from a metric evaluated at the shareholder and Wall Street analyst level. And we're starting to see momentum where from the S&P, the Moody's, and other rating companies, incorporating not just kind of the ESG and the other aspects of sustainability aspects, but some of these core things where it's not just pure bottom line profit, but it takes into account all these other things that really wasn't part of the picture. Sure, shareholder and capitalization is increasing, but at what cost, right? So
Exactly.
that's really important from incentive structure. Now, first of all, going back a little bit, if you could define green chemistry for those that are not familiar with it, and some of the principles that then you guys distill into the sustainable design that can be then incorporated into corporate strategy, operations, and supply chain.
Yeah, absolutely. So I'll briefly touch upon green chemistry since Paul is the expert. But green chemistry is essentially the science of creating inherently sustainable products and processes that are non-toxic to human beings and environmentally benign. And I've heard Paul say this often, which is our present day reality. This is not by accident. Everything that we do is essentially designing for the future. And so when, 100, 200 years ago, when our existing processes were laid in place, people were not thinking, well, how can I be the most extractive and how can I create the worst product for consumers? Obviously, it is just that there was a knowledge gap, and this the system level design was not something that was considered when these processes were laid into place. And so green chemistry really takes a system level view as to how your products and processes are created and puts forth 12 principles. And if those principles are followed, you should, in theory, be able to design a product or process that is environmentally benign or degrades in a non-toxic manner and is non-toxic to human health. And so, it goes into various chemistry principles that speak to the management principles we have in the book. For example, atom economy in the 12 principles directly relates to waste prevention. And note, we are not saying minimize waste. We are saying prevent it. So when your budget is allocated in the design phase for something, that's when one of your levers should be designing out the waste. The second principle is maximizing performance. And that's where we consider that triple bottom line, but we consider it in terms of product specs as well. And then, of course, the usage of renewable inputs and ensuring safe degradation.
So let's talk about something practical that everyone can understand. Let's give maybe 3 examples: solar roofs, electric car batteries, and then plastics.
Absolutely.
In all these cases, let's stay with the solar panels, for example. There are known R&D and capabilities that uses less rare elements as well as less toxic elements. The issue is cost. So commercially, what's still readily available are those that actually still have chemical toxic. So when those panels basically become degraded because of heat and other thermal aspects over time, and the performance starts to decline and they need to be replaced, there's a whole issue around recycling. And of course, it gets into e-waste because, again, how do you actually recycle these things properly where the e-waste and the toxic doesn't go into the ground like we've seen with other electronics? And then EV batteries, right? So there's the mining issue, and mining is only going to get bigger, frankly, because of the demand for it. But there's a recycling. There are efforts that's being made around recycling. There's storage capabilities that uses a lot smarter and different types of benign types of elements. But again, it's not at a point where it's commercializable and the cost is quite there to support it. How do we reconcile that? And just the fact that from a CPG, most companies are still very much utilizing plastics for their everyday packaging, even though they talk ESG and sustainability.
Absolutely. And I'm glad you mentioned this because these are some of the harder issues as it relates to sustainability. These are some of the ones that we mentioned in the book, where we talk about the longer runway to commercialization and what can be done to sort of bridge that gap. And So one is, Scott, as you accurately mentioned, which is the knowledge gap. We quite simply, in some cases, will require more research. Of course, more funding will fuel that further research. But then the other case is that some technologies may require greater investment, even if they are somewhat closer to the point that they can be commercialized. And so what we recommend to firms is two things. One is to begin with a pilot. Begin with some low-hanging fruit where you can innovate a product or process and demonstrate a successful business case and leverage those revenues to spill over and sort of invest in your next innovation. And that can create a cascading flow of change within your organization. And the second is, for some of those larger issues, is to co-invest in solutions. A lot of firms have the same issue. For example, e-waste. You accurately mentioned these things end up in landfills and they degrade in extremely toxic manners. And also, there's, of course, the famous study on the 6 kg microchip, where the amount of waste produced in creating one microchip, which is probably weightless, or very, very low in weight if you were to hold it, is actually 6 kilograms if you were to factor in all the material inputs, and probably only 5% of them have made it towards the actual end product. And so in these cases, we recommend co-investment along with other firms, and leading organizations are doing this. By the way, firms that are recognizing that they need to create a corporate strategy that will keep them relevant for the next 50 to 100 years are investing in the future through co-investments and by way of associations in collaboration with academic institutions. But that actually goes back to probably your expertise, which is structuring a portfolio such that you can realize initial wins and initial profitability, and let that cascade over into sort of fueling the rest of your portfolio, which has a longer runway.
Two different questions that I want to ask. One is, I think from again, being as practical as possible, is that most companies, if given the opportunity to co-invest versus allocate into marketing spend for narrative and storytelling, they rather do the latter. And I wonder how the current methods of implementing ESG are, as you call it, reductive and myopic. So that's first question. I'll pause for the second one.
Yeah, thank you. Yes, that is reductive and myopic, right? Because we are in a scenario where actually we anticipate some firms will eventually become dinosaurs, and it may not happen in the next quarter or even the next year. But eventually, if firms are not able to demonstrate progress or demonstrate that there is actual action backing up their corporate messaging and their marketing, consumers will catch on. And so that's one. And then the second is they just might be out innovated. They're in our, sort of startup culture. There are startups that spin out of academic institutions that might have leading technology. There are visionary investors such as yourself that are looking for the next impactful Google, if you will, in the climate tech space. And as these firms scale up, they will be the disruptor that these large organizations keep an eye on, and will start regarding them as their peers, and will need to understand that they'll need to innovate themselves in order to stay relevant in the market.
Absolutely. It makes perfect sense. The second question I was going to ask is looking at it more contextually the current times. So at the time of this recording, which is early July, we're still been in months and months of war with Ukraine and Russia, of course. And that has had huge implications. Some even opine as to that war being architected artificially to inflate commodities. So where we are at this point is EU is starving for natural gas. It's impacted the cost of crude oil. Not only now recently because of recession fears has crude oil prices start to reverse a bit, but natural gas is probably the most expensive commodity at this point. And frankly, there's not enough to go around. And there's even word that in New England states, West Coast and other parts of the world, there's going to be brownouts, if not blackouts, because so much of what is used to generate electricity as well as the heating in the winter is through natural gas. How do we deal with this and the inconvenient truth that the reality is for us to transition to carbon neutral, carbon reduction? That transitional period is very messy, and that we're going to have to be relying upon fossil fuels for a long time.
Absolutely. There's no easy answer to this, and a lot of cascading externalities, as you mentioned, not just those, but even if you think about the recent chip shortage, and the action from the US was to simply build more foundries, whereas that's probably not the most resilient solution if we're thinking about it economically. If we were to realistically think about, a long runway solution that can make us resilient in the next 50 to 100 years, we should probably be thinking of alternatives in the chip space, or even simply trying to mine the chips that are present in landfills and creating a collection methodology for that at scale. And so, yeah, exactly to your point, I think this is exactly the inflection point that will potentially serve as that lever to increase the investment in alternatives, although I do think realistically we'll need fossil to support that transition, because that 0 to 1 quick switch, neither is it practical nor realistic, and would be disastrous for an economy that has been designed to run on fossil.
Mm-hmm. Great point. I want to go back to the sustainability scorecard. If you could deconstruct and go maybe a little bit deeper into the methodology, give us an idea of what it's comprised of, and maybe some example scorecards as well.
Yeah, absolutely. So the 4 principles that we mentioned and I've shared before, we distill them in the book, and we actually have some scorecards that we go through at the very end. And one I can share actually that comes to mind at this moment is probably the one for P2 Science. And this is a great example of a firm that is innovating chemical inputs into the cosmetics and hair care industry at the moment, and fragrances. I recently saw a press release that they have now executed a partnership with Living Proof, which is a subsidiary of Unilever. And I think that economically that's interesting, because a large firm is recognizing that they cannot, the best strategy for them to innovate is to probably partner with leading firms that are actually innovating the market space by creating inherently sustainable, benign, non-toxic chemical inputs that will go into your hair care products and cosmetics. One simply has to go on EWG.com, Environmental Working Group, or any such website where you can check the toxicity level of your cosmetics that you wear every day. And so that's an environmental exposure that we receive every day when we wear cosmetics or use shampoo. So looking at it from the scorecard standpoint, when you think about the first component, which is waste prevention, the methodology by which P2 Science is producing this chemical, actually, in comparison to traditional solutions, they actually eliminate 95% of the waste by designing out the waste. So therefore they achieve an economy of waste. They achieve an economy of space. These chemical molecules are smaller, more compact, and this process is, it's a continuous process. It's intensified. That's just a chemistry term that was relevant to this use case. But essentially, those 3 elements speak to waste prevention, which helps them achieve that 95% better than your traditional product. Thinking about performance and the expansion of the word performance to not only include efficiency, but also get into the social and environmental good aspect of it. This is where we look at sort of your environmental health metrics. So when it degrades, does it degrade safely? Whether that's in a landfill, or can you mine certain components? And over here, because it's a cosmetic, you're going to wash it off your face. or it's a shampoo, and we look at sort of the global warming potential, the acidification potential, the exposure risks to your hair. Is it actually increasing the health of your hair, or is it just providing you less fizz and providing you a benefit while damaging your hair? And so along all of these KPIs, it actually showed that it was extremely high. It's actually increasing the health of your hair and your skin without creating any damage, or negligible at best. It wasn't something that they could physically record. And that is a far departure from most products in the market today. So that is our second principle. The third is renewable resources, and I think this is the tricky one, where when most products are created, there is a component of being fueled by fossil, as you rightly mentioned, and we discussed earlier in this podcast. And so what this firm does, interestingly, is that it uses renewable resources as one of the conditions for its manufacturing process. And so therefore, it achieves carbon neutrality in that regard. And also the material inputs from that fossil don't have those negative externalities in their byproducts, because that input has been prevented. And then safe degradation is, we look at measures like persistence, bioaccumulation, and exposure, which I discussed earlier. So persistence is when these chemicals go into your soil or go into your groundwater, do they live forever? Are they forever chemicals? Do we get to love them forever with humanity as a human race? And the answer is no. For all of these chemical inputs are benign, and they degrade safely. They do not persist in the environment, and they do not have a bioaccumulation effect, which is another public health lever that we look at, which is, does the concentration of this chemical increase as this chemical is consumed and up the food chain? And so we look at the biological accumulation of that, and we say that actually there isn't any accumulation, negligible at best, and therefore it's again performing more effectively than your traditional products.
So as I'm listening, I think it actually aligns very well. One of the investments that we've made at Astor Perkins is in Brightseed, which is based out of South San Francisco. And what they're doing is they're actually doing computational biology to unearth all the phytonutrients found in the plant kingdom, edible as well as not edible, and including the ocean plants as well. And so instead of, as we've all pretty much have read, is that pharmaceuticals, when we think that once it's out of our bodies, it's not. But in fact, when we use a bathroom, it goes in the sewer system and it stays. And there are times when certain dangerous chemicals have even persisted in kids that drank, tap water, for example. On the other hand, Brightseed is actually using compounds in plant kingdom to really accentuate health benefits. And going back to the example you provided on cosmetic, for example, instead of using harsh chemicals, you could use plant-based elements that provide similar functionality or characteristics that doesn't have any of the negative externalities that they're referring to. So there's definitely opportunities here. And I wonder, as a kind of a finishing question, is when we, as innovators and corporations, choose to integrate sustainable design, what are some of the positive, unexpected solutions and results that they can expect?
Yeah, absolutely. Well, so a couple things is, one, you're looking at some cost avoidance. When we constantly expose ourselves to the byproducts of the products we use, or the processes that went into making these products, you are avoiding that risk of litigation, class action lawsuits, things like that are really common and make their way into firm sustainability reports and risk assessment reports and things like that. So there's a cost avoidance aspect to it, the improved health of workers, and the fact that you can have continuous operations without risking worker health, safe transportation, avoided costs related to handling of waste and things like that. So there's huge cost avoidance aspect to this. In terms of revenues, I would say that you can probably even think about expanding your market or even market penetration. And even thinking about customer lifetime value, to constantly be able to innovate your own products, to engage customers along the lines of health and wellness is becoming an increasingly important lever that can drive your future revenues. So there's an avoidance and revenue generation aspect to this.
Super. Well, we're very excited. And with that, I have been joined by Dr. Urvashi Bhatnagar, a co-author of the Sustainability Scorecard. Thank you for joining today.
Thank you.
If you've enjoyed this episode, take a moment to rate our show on any podcast platform that you listen to. Scroll down to the bottom and push 5 stars. It's that easy. And as always, thanks for listening.